just going to give it a little bit of time to let everyone log in. In the meantime, you can look at the pretty picture of a green-winged orchid. And just welcome to those of you who are arriving today, this lunchtime. Hopefully you've been enjoying some of the nice weather recently and getting out into some of the grasslands to have a look at what's there. Still got 1 minute, so just waiting on a few others to arrive. So a warm welcome to those who have arrived so far, and thank you for joining us this lunchtime session. As per usual, being a webinar, I'm sure you're all very bored of me saying this now, but I can't see or hear you. So if you do need to contact us for anything, you please use the chat, and Rachel will be in the background manning that. If you have any questions for me for the end to do with this habitat type, then use the Q&A function if you can, just because it makes it really helpful for us to see where all the questions are at the end. We will try and fit as many of those as we can, but obviously we've got quite a lot to get through in the short time that we have. So what we're going to look at today is a bit of a closer look at two of our fine habitats, neutral damp grassland and neutral pastures and meadows. These were also covered last year by Dominic Price. So I've decided to focus on some of the species that he didn't cover in that webinar. So almost want to watch that one in conjunction with this one if you really want to get to know your habitat. Right, so I will begin. Just get up all of the information that I need and we can start. Right, so first of all, where do these fine habitat categories sit? So we've got the NPMS lowland grassland as our broad habitat category. So essentially that is everything that's not in the sort of montane or upland regions, roughly about over 400 meters or so. And within that broad habitat, we've also got the fine habitat dry acid grassland and dry calcareous grassland, of which are associated very much with other surrounding habitats and geology and things like that. We've then got neutral damp grassland and neutral pastures and meadows, also within the broad habitat category. And these are the two that we're going to cover today. And part of the reason for doing both of them is that they are quite similar in a lot of ways, and almost you can have both within one area, which I'll go into a bit more detail. So first of all, let's start with neutral damp grassland. And what is it exactly? So essentially, it kind of would be described maybe as marshy grassland or rush pasture, but there is a caveat with rush pasture, which I will go into a little bit in a bit. It's going to be in the lowland regions, so we're talking about not in the montane or sort of uplands. This is in your lowland, sort of below 400 meter mark. We'll be looking at its mostly moderately fertile soils, but you could also have nutrient poor clays and loams as well included. But it creates quite a lush vegetation essentially. So that's, quite important to remember. It can be wet maybe all year round and feel wet under feet, or maybe it's just seasonally flooded. And sometimes brackish water that floods in can also be included within this category. It's usually within a sort of floodplain area, or sometimes maybe even on the edge of another category, sort of fens or marshes and swamps. So it could be sort of on the periphery of that, but essentially it's going to have quite a lot of water content. Then, as I mentioned, we've got rush pasture, which is essentially poorly drained hillsides, but obviously we're not talking about in the uplands above 400 meters. So there'll be sort of, getting your OS map and seeing where you are height wise. And it's usually that species poor rather than species rich, with clumps of rushes. But it is important to note that if you're potentially on peaty soils, then that won't necessarily be in this category. And I will go into that a little bit more in a minute. Usually the dominant grasses that you might find, definitely tufted hair grass is likely to be there in some way. Creeping bent, which likes it quite wet. False oak grass, kind of your all-rounder, find everywhere. Red fescue and Yorkshire fog, quite common. So what are the key signs to whether you've got neutral damp grassland? So we just covered some of the grasses, but as I said, tufted hairgrass is, one of those real key ones that you're likely to find if it is neutral damp. Now, it doesn't mean that if you haven't got it, you haven't, but it is just quite likely to be there. And also, interestingly, about tufted hairgrass is that it's quite a coarse, hard grass. If you've ever sort of felt it, it feels almost sedgy, which means that animals tend to graze around it. So it often leaves these sort of tussocks of tufted hairgrass in the grassland sward. Again, we've got Yorkshire fog. Rough meadow grass is often there as well, which tends to like it sort of slightly wetter and maybe slightly shadier, that sort of thing, and red fescue as well. It might be that it's the sort of darker green areas in fields from a distance. It might look like it's darker green due to the amount of rushes and that damper vegetation. And that is the real key here. So if you've got rushes, soft rush or jointed rush, hard rush, any of those rushes, which we kind of all put together as a group for NPMS anyway, but if you've got lots of rushes, then you're probably looking at neutral damp grassland. You can get also a lovely mix of other herb species that aren't necessarily NPMS indicators, but are just likely to indicate to you that you've got neutral damp grassland. Would be things like bugle in the grassland sward, marsh thistle, bog stitchwort, cuckoo flower, obviously finished sort of mostly at this time of year, marsh bedstraw, greater bird's foot trefoil rather than our common bird's foot trefoil, which is a greater bird's foot trefoil, slightly more robust and quite hairy. Ragged robin and meadowsweet, they would also be other ones that you might have there. So then if we move on to the next category, the neutral pastures and meadows, again, as I said, very, very similar in a lot of ways. So again, it's going to be on neutral soil, so clays or loams, and it can actually also be slightly damp. Again, we're talking about the lowlands, so not above the 400-metre mark. And again, these can also be flooded in winter. They're usually enclosed fields managed for maybe hay and or livestock grazing of some kind. So if it's on a traditional management sort of regime, it might be cut for hay sort of in the middle to late summer and then grazed over winter. It could also be grazed all year round by cattle, particularly if it's managed as a nature reserve or something, or maybe it's sheep or even pony grazed. Ideally, we're looking at the unimproved or the good quality semi-improved. Now, if you've not heard of this terminology before, it's essentially talking about whether it's had improvement for agricultural means. So if you improve a field, for us, it might sound a bit silly, like, oh, it must be really nice then. But actually, it's talking about how productive it is as grazing or hay sort of production. In which case it might have been ploughed up, it might have been resown, it might have had fertilizer applied to it, or even sort of some kind of herbicide sprays. So basically, we don't want to be looking at those ones really. We want to look at the ones that are unimproved, which means they've been traditionally managed for a long, long, long time, often nature reserves and things like that. Or we're looking at more that good quality semi-improved. So it hasn't really been intensively improved with lots and lots of fertilizer or ploughed up or anything, but perhaps it's not quite as good as your sort of classic nature reserves and things full of species. So they are generally species rich, but as I say, certainly in some fields you can get areas that are maybe remnant species rich, but areas that are less species rich where the grazing's been maybe more intense, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of variability across an entire field sometimes. If we're talking about these habitats more north of the UK, then we're probably looking at what is termed as upland hay meadows. But again, they're probably not actually upland, that's just the terminology that's used in the north. The grass species that's likely to be quite dominant or quite present are things like crested dog's tail, red fescue, and sort of sweet vernal grass. But again, you could also get things like the Yorkshire fog, the cocksfoot, the false oak grass, that sort of thing, depending on the quality of the grassland. So what are some of the key signs that you've got neutral pastures and meadows? So those grasses, again, remember we talked about you could have some of those other species I mentioned, but also things like meadow foxtail, the crested dog's tail is a real key one, and things like the meadow fescue and tall fescue. Again, none of these are NPMS indicators, but if you did ever want to get familiar with these grasses, these could be useful in telling you what you've got. As I said, there's a real wide variability in diversity levels across a field sometimes. Maybe there's some areas that are on a slope or just, again, less sort of high intensively sort of improved, and you might get a really good patch basically within a field. You can have calcareous or acidic influences across the field. And that can even vary. You can have some patches that are sort of showing you slightly more acidic influences and some areas that are showing you slightly more calcareous influences, depending on the species that are present. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about dry calcareous or dry acid grassland group. There's just sometimes some variation, and it doesn't all have to be completely neutral. Again, as I said, it has a similar composition to neutral damp, but generally don't have all those rushes and those slightly more wetter species. So you might have things like the common birdsfoot trefoil rather than the greater birdsfoot trefoil. Can you get both habitats in the same field? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. As I was saying, it might be that you've got one half that's higher up on a slope, and then you've got impeded drainage down the bottom half, and you've got a lot more rushes. And again, that might seem darker from a distance, and it might have more of those rushes present. So it's worth bearing in mind, if you are going to set up a plot in a field like this, you don't want to set up your plot where it spans both of the habitats. You want to have it in one or the other. Now, it might be that you want to select where is easiest to survey and get to, or maybe closest to that point on the grid system. But definitely try not to have it spanning both of those two different habitats, because you want to select one fine habitat for your plot. So what sort of management could you find in the grasslands that you're coming across? So as I said, it could be cut for hay. Generally, hay cuts are taken ideally towards sort of July time, although they're getting earlier and earlier. Things like silage and haylage will be taken much earlier in the season, and often those are the more agriculturally improved meadows. It could be being grazed all year round, or just maybe through the winter, which you might not know if you're going to, while it's sort of as a hay crop, you might not know that it's grazed in the winter. So that's where having a bit of a conversation with the person who manages it, if you can be useful. It could be being grazed by sheep, cattle, ponies, and even llamas in some cases, or things like that. Generally, if it is sheep or ponies, quite intensively sometimes can be kind of grazed right down, and it can be tricky to identify species. Now, if you've got something like ridge and furrow present, then that's really suggestive of a good semi-improved or unimproved meadow, just because that old ridge and furrow suggests that it hasn't been sort of ploughed in modern times, and often you can get really, really species-rich assemblages on ridge and furrow sites, and you often get a difference in the species that appear on the top of the ridges and then those that appear in the furrows as well. Now, we don't want to be including pastures that I said that are heavily fertilized, sprayed, or resown with a sort of rye, perennial rye or Italian rye mix, just because that is not what we're really trying to monitor here. And don't forget, obviously, some sites could be rabbit grazed as well as everything else. So it's worth noting if there's any rabbit droppings and things like that. If you've got old anthills, quite significant, sizable old anthills, that is another sign that you're probably looking at a better quality grassland that could be within this category, because it hasn't been ploughed recently, otherwise they wouldn't have established. So just to cover when it's better to record in another category, we were talking about before about the rush pastures. So if we're talking about damp grasslands that are more on that acidic or mineral peats, like fen meadows. If it's a fen meadow, it's going to have lots and lots of sedge species and things like that, or whether it's purple moor grasses on those sort of peaty grounds, then we want to really include those under acidic fens, flushes, mires and springs. That's a difficult one to say, isn't it? So, if you're ever not sure, you're up in an area where you think you've got lots of purple moor grass, so you think it's rush pasture and it's maybe on peat, do just take a note of some of the bits of vegetation and come get in touch with your local mentor who will know that area really well, and they will probably best be able to advise you on what habitat to classify it as. Also, if you've got grassland where maybe it's sort of in a mosaic of where there's lots of heather and gorse nearby, then maybe you might be looking at dry acid grassland. So it's just worth double checking that. And if you think that you're on chalk, you know, it's really chalky around there, you're on some downs and you've got some nice dry grassland, have a look at the species composition, because maybe it's actually going to be pushed more into that dry calcareous category. When not to include it as an NPMS habitat at all, things like if it has been sown with that perennial rye mix for silage or haylage, you know, really the image actually that I've got at the background here is a field behind my house that last year was sown with more like a herbal ley, so a mix of grasses with a sort of nitrogen fixing legumes and things like that. Now that was sown just for haylage or silage, and you know, I'm not going to want to monitor that because lo and behold, this winter it was completely ploughed up and now there's winter wheat out there. So that's not the kind of habitat we want. It's something that's more been established as a grassland for quite a long time. Yes, so if it's been intensively managed and ploughed up and then re-sown, then it might not be suitable. And particularly if there's no longer any diversity at all and it's all just grass species, then you might not want to include it as NPMS because it's not really semi-natural anymore. If it is so heavily grazed all year round that you cannot actually identify any species, that is going to make it quite difficult to include it as a plot. This is rarely the case though. There's usually some areas that you can still identify species, but some horse grazed areas can be like this and it can be quite tricky. Also, don't survey it if it would be dangerous for you to survey it due to, I don't know, their bulls or some kind of grazing animal that means that it would be too dangerous for you to go in there and survey it. So just remember that. So some examples of both of these kind of fine habitats. You could have the traditional hay meadows, which is always lovely. You could have, sorry, it's being really slow, floodplain meadows. So that's probably going to be in your damp neutral. You could have the pony grazing, but maybe it's not so intensively managed. You could also include the neutral pastures and meadows under churchyards. A lot of really, really nice habitat, grassland habitat in many, many churchyards. Also your road verges. If you've got a nice grassland road verge, then that's going to be under your neutral pastures and meadows. Some plain fields now have been, you know, large areas have been left uncut and are being more managed as meadows. So they could also be included. Or even your local village green where similar sort of management is taking place. So it's not always just your post and rail fencing meadows. The likely kind of grassland assemblages that you're likely to find. In your damp grassland, you might have something like Yorkshire fog, a bit of marsh marigold, ragged robin, but again, remember those rushes will be in abundance everywhere. Whereas your pasture and meadow, you might have something like crested dog's tail, common knapweed, red clover, oxeye daisy, and yellow rattle maybe. Another pasture and meadow, maybe if you're further north in northern England, you might have lady's mantle, melancholy thistle, and wood cranesbill, all specialties of meadows up that far north. Not something I've ever visited before, and I certainly would love to. Sounds lovely. Or maybe you've got another damp neutral grassland, and again, you're full of rushes everywhere, and you've got meadow foxtail and lots of buttercups. Buttercups generally quite like it a bit damp, so that could be another example. When is the best time to survey and how to survey? So remember, for grasslands, you want your plot size to be 5 by 5 meters. The question about how wooded your plot is, it's likely that you're not really going to have you're going to have the option of no trees or scrub. You might have scattered trees or scrub or whatever, but potentially if it's not heavily managed and it's been left for a long time and you've got sort of maybe hawthorn bushes coming up here and there. Now, you'll be pleased to know there's only one grass species to identify at wildflower level, and there are 6 more at indicator level. So a bit of a jump there, but hopefully some of the training that we provide will help with that. Get to know your plots for best timings, but generally we're talking about late May, early June for best times for your first survey, sort of standard NPMS guidance on when to start. But find out maybe if it is managed for hay, when is it cut? So these days it seems to be getting earlier and earlier. I know there's lots of places being cut now and we're only in June, in which case if you do your later survey sort of towards or the end of August or mid-August, you might find that some of the species have grown back up enough for you to still be able to identify things. And just be mindful of grazing animals when you're going in. So if there's a time where maybe they've got young, then maybe avoid that. Or if you know that they're going to be moving them, then maybe that would be useful information. The vegetation heights and percentages with grassland. So remember again, with your recording form, you've got the 2 boxes on the vegetation height, and that's for your first and your second visit. And the vegetation heights don't have to add up to 100%. So just always with a caveat to that. And it's only an estimate. But in all likelihood, most of your scoring will occur in the first 2 boxes, your under 10 centimetres and your 11 to 30 centimetres. And you might have the little bit sort of in that 31 to 100 centimetres, depending on the time of year and maybe whether it's been cut or grazed. So we're going to go through a few species at wildflower level now. And remember, these are the species that weren't covered before previously last year when we covered this habitat type with Dominic Price. So I've just filtered through, seen which ones that he didn't cover and thought, right, I'm going to focus on these. So first of all, we're going to go through quite a few from the pastures and meadows and just one species that's in both of those. So we've got crosswort, hedge bedstraw, oxeye daisy, meadow saxifrage, and common Valerian. So the one we're going to start off with first is crosswort, an absolute lovely plant, one of my favourites. So it's actually a member of the bedstraw family, so the same as cleavers or goosegrass, sticky grass, whatever you want to call it. However, it's not as obvious as part of that group because of the fact that the leaves are that much wider and chunky, but it is arranged in that same way. It's a really, really hairy plant, so you can see from this photo, really hairy leaves and really hairy stems. The leaves, you get them 4 of them in a whorl. So if we remember from this bedstraw family, most of them have well, in fact, they all have their leaves arranged in this whorl structure around the main stem. So just to give you an example of what that actually means, that is referring to a whorl of leaves. However, crosswort's only got 4, whereas most of the other bedstraws usually have more than that. The leaves themselves, as I said, they're quite broadly oval or elliptical, and they are 3-veined. You can see from this image here, you've got a vein down the center, and then you've got 2 veins either side. So that's quite obviously 3-veined. And you can see in this image as well that it's a general sort of yellowy green appearance to the plant. So we've got yellow flowers, but also the tinge to the leaves is quite yellowy green. The flowers are in axillary clusters that are shorter than the leaves. So that just means that the flowers are arranged at the base of where the leaves come out. This is just an example of showing you that sort of what axillary clusters mean. But you can see that they're actually quite a lot shorter than the leaves themselves. So you've got those flowers arranged like that, but they're much shorter than the leaves. And the flowers are yellow. So another one in that family that has yellow flowers is lady's bedstraw, but it's not hairy and it's very fine, and it has all of its flowers as a sort of terminal cluster at the end. So this is quite different. Apparently, it's honey scented when sort of crushed. So I've never actually experimented with this, but maybe if you find it next time, you could have a look for me. So another one in the bedstraw family, this one's hedge bedstraw. Oh, and just to point out that this little black flower symbol down in the corner indicates that it is a species to be recorded at wildflower level, which I'm going through first. So yes, another one in the bedstraw family. So this one looks very much more like your sort of cleavers, your sticky grass, but it's quite a robust plant. But again, it's got that sort of sprawling habit similar to cleavers. You know, it doesn't really like to grow on its own in its own right. It sort of falls onto everything else as it grows. And this image, just to show you quite handily the 2 in comparison. So we've got the slightly darker, glossier green and fatter leaves of the hedge bedstraw here, where we've got the cleavers next to it, much more sort of sprawled and less compact with that leaf arrangement, and obviously very, very sort of sticky with those sort of hooked hairs. Whereas hedge bedstraw you can't throw it at people's clothes and it will stick because it just doesn't have that. Again, so there are 6 to 8 leaves per whorl, whereas before when we saw crosswort, it only had the 4. This is just you can see that sort of arrangement of the leaves all the way around. The leaves themselves are lanceolate or obovate, so it just means they sort of have that general sort of shape, a narrowed shape to them, but also rounded. And you can see they are one veined, unlike the crosswort, which had those 3 veins on it. The leaves are said to be mucronate. Now, if you've not come across this terminology before, it refers to this sort of bristle tip to the end of the leaf. Things like black medic are mucronate, and it can distinguish it from lesser trefoil. So just these little features can be quite useful. Now, this is quite useful as well, especially with the other bedstraws in the family. The prickles on the edges are forward pointing, so it's quite hard to show you without the use of a hand lens, but I've just done a quick illustration to show you exactly what that's referring to. And it just means that there's little sort of prickles along the edges of the leaves, and they are forward pointing. And the flowers are white, so unlike that of lady's bedstraw, or which it could be confused with in some circumstances. But they are white and in these large terminal panicles where they're sort of arranged sort of spirally around the top. Moving on now to oxeye daisy, which is a relatively easy one to identify, but I thought we'd cover it because it's in both of the habitats, neutral pastures and meadows and damp grassland. Damp grassland. Oxeye daisy, so it's actually a member of the daisy family, no shock there, Asteraceae, meaning that it's, like all of those, it's got multiple flowers on one flower head consisting of the ray florets, the white ones around the outside, and the yellow disc florets in the center. And there's just some more pretty pictures of it, and you can see just how different those florets are from the ones in the center up to the ones on the outside. So it's a slightly hairy plant, and it's up to about 20 to 70 centimeters tall, so it can get quite tall. I have absolutely loads of it growing in my garden right now, and it can take over in places. It's not really very branched. It tends to sort of send up one sort of, flowering stem, and it doesn't divide up into many, many others. So it's not very branched. And the flower head itself is on quite a long stalk away from the leaves. And it's daisy-like, so it basically looks like a huge daisy with those white ray florets and the yellow disc florets, just like a daisy does. The leaves, they're quite a sort of dark green. So we were talking before about crosswort having that sort of yellowish green, whereas oxeye daisy is all a sort of dark green colour. And the basal rosette of leaves is sort of not flat to the ground like sort of dandelion type cat's ear or something like that. It's sort of a loose basal rosette with them sort of spiraling up, but sort of not flat to the ground. The basal leaves themselves are sort of roughly spoon shaped with an abrupt narrowing to the stalk. And then the basal leaves are sometimes, lobed as well, sort of either sort of heavily toothed or lobed. Whereas the stem leaves are stalkless and are usually clasping the stem, and the stem leaves are deeply toothed, sort of more akin to a dandelion sort of leaf generally. So moving on to this one, Meadow Saxifrage, not a common one. I've only seen it in churchyards before, interestingly, where it seems to still be holding on. I don't see it in many actual meadows, which is a bit of a shame. So the leaves are all in a basal rosette again, but obviously if it's all grown up amongst tall grasslands, it can be hard to find that, especially if they've been shaded out. Things don't always do so well at that point. But if you're first seeing it growing up for the year, then you're likely to see the leaves in a basal rosette. So you can see here, these images have been taken when the grassy sward hasn't grown up massively around it, or maybe it's been cut recently, so you can see it. But sometimes basal leaves die off when they're sort of over shadowed by other things. The basal leaves themselves are kidney shaped, but they're also sort of bluntly toothed, so it's got a kidney overall shape, but then they've got these sort of notches or teeth in them, and they are sort of scattered with these long hairs, you can see all the way around. The stem leaves, though, are much shorter stalked and generally just smaller. Now, the flower stems themselves are stickily hairy, and that's because of these glandular hairs that's all over the stem. So you can see this great image here shows you've got these cells of these hairs with these sort of little red sticky blobs on the end, and these are the glands of the glandular hairs. And basically, if you were to sort of pick it up and feel it, it would feel slightly sticky. And you can even see they go all the way up. You can see those sort of blobby, sticky hairs onto the calyx underneath and the flowering stem. There's usually 2 to 12 white flowers. They're quite a good size flower, quite beautiful really. And they have 2 capsuled fruits when they're finished. And you can just about make out that you've got the sort of 2 capsules in the center there, which would then mature into 2 capsuled fruit. But a really, really beautiful one. So nice to find if you do. Moving on to common valerian now. I think it's the last of our wildflower species at wildflower level. Now, common valerian, it often looks a bit like it might be part of the sort of cow parsley, the carrot family, but actually it's not. It's part of the Valerian family, which is quite a small family in the UK anyway. Now, all leaves are opposite, which I haven't entirely represented in my images, apologies for that, but they are. And the leaves are pinnate, which just means that they're divided once. So you've got the main stem and then you've got individual leaflets coming off. So they are pinnate. Whereas the lower leaves are also pinnate, but long stalked, whereas the upper ones are stalkless. The umbel like terminal inflorescence. So it's this sort of big candy floss type thing here. So it's not the carrot family, but it has like that sort of almost umbel-like inflorescence. The actual corollas, the individual petal arrangements, they're sort of a pinkish white. As it matures, it gets more and more white, whereas when it's first in bud, it's much pinker. The actual individual leaflets themselves, so these individual bits are quite sort of bluntly toothed. You can just make it out, almost sort of got a nettly edge to them. So the other one that this could be confused with is marsh valerian, which would be one of our indicators in neutral damp grassland, but not neutral pastures and meadows, being that it's a marshy species. Marsh valerian has those basal leaves that are undivided, so not pinnate, and they are sort of oval elliptical with long stalks. And the stem leaves are pinnatophyid, which means that they look like they're pinnate, but they're not quite individual leaflets. So that's one of the differences with marsh valerian. So moving on now to the indicator species. So we've got a few from neutral damp and one from pastures and meadows and one that occurs in both of them. So we're going to go through Agrimony, Meadow Barley, so the only grasses that we're doing, and reed canary-grass, the 2 grasses there, greater Burnet-saxifrage and pepper saxifrage. So we're going to start with Agrimony first of all. It's a rather stunning little plant. It's all out in flower now. If you've seen it, likes road verges. So there's loads around me at the moment. So it's quite a hairy plant. You can see from this image where I'm holding it, it is generally quite hairy, the leaves, the stalks, everything like that. The leaves are pinnate, so that's where we've got that division into the individual leaflets. But interestingly, between the main leaflets, you've got these smaller leaflets between the main pairs. So they almost look like they're sort of just about to start, but they're not going to get any bigger than that. So there's a few species of plant that look like this, sort of some of the like salad burnet, things like that, have this look to them, but Agrimony is quite sort of roughly toothed in that arrangement. So yes, as I was saying, the actual individual leaflets are really quite deeply toothed. So that, and you can just see how hairy it is on this one. So it's not scented or scarcely so. Now, the reason I mention that is because there are 2 Agrimony species. There's just common Agrimony and then there's fragrant Agrimony. Fragrant Agrimony is much less common, and obviously as it spells out, it's meant to be fragrant. However, you can get some common Agrimony that's slightly fragrant, and smell is very subjective anyway, so it's a difficult one to sort of base it on. But generally speaking, common Agrimony should not be that scented. It has these lovely yellow flowers in these long towering spikes for each plant. So you're not going to have multiple spikes from one. It's usually just one spike of flowers per plant. And they are this lovely sort of pale lemony yellow. Now, the fruit, which is what you will be left with, obviously, once they've all been pollinated and it's turning into its seeds, they are quite a key factor in deciding whether you've got common Agrimony or fragrant Agrimony. So in common Agrimony, which is the indicator for this habitat, it's got a grooved top shaped, which I think it means like a spinning top, cup with hooked spines along the top. So you can see this is the actual image of the seeds here. And you can just about make out from this image that it's grooved, which I've tried to represent in this image. But the important thing is that the hooked spines are horizontal or sort of come outwards around the side, but they're not reflexed back onto themselves towards that sort of bottom part. Whereas fragrant agrimony, firstly, it doesn't have the grooves on the seeded cup shape, and the hooked hairs or spines will be reflexing back onto itself. So might be interesting just occasionally, if you do see agrimony out and about, just get your hand lens out and have a little look at those fruits if it's already turned into fruits. So a grass, oh, don't worry, we're all going to be fine. It's okay. We don't include many grasses in NPMS, but sometimes we do have to include some. And don't worry, this one's a very, very distinctive one and beautiful as well. So meadow barley. It's a very slender grass. It's quite sort of fine. It's got a sort of real delicateness about it. And one of the things that you can interestingly check out is that it's got short spreading auricles. So if we just remind ourselves what an auricle is, it's basically a small projection from where the leaf blade meets the stem. So it's not the ligule, that is something else. These are not all grasses have auricles at all, but they're sort of these like papery membranous bits that come out from the edges. And that's basically in this image here, you can just about make it out. You've got this sort of long tip here with this wavy edge and another one there. So those are the short spreading auricles. The leaf sheath is not inflated. Now, when you read this in the book, you're like, what on earth is it talking about? So first of all, the leaf sheath is this basal part of the grass leaf that encircles the stem before it then becomes the main blade and juts out. So it sort of grows up encircling the stem before it comes out. And in meadow barley, and well, in some of the Hordeums, these can be quite inflated, but it's not inflated in this species. So that's worth noting. The ligules themselves, so if you remember, the ligule is that thin membranous outgrowth that's from the base of the blade of most grasses. That is a very, very short. And you can see the actual inflorescence, which is all of the flowers and the spikelets together, are quite distinctive with these really, really long spiked awns and a sort of slightly purplish tone to them. Generally, this grass is usually found in old pastures or meadows. You know, it can be a good sign that you might have a nice quality grassland there, but equally you can find it in one that's been heavily degraded as well. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I've seen this everywhere walking along the pavements and getting covered in dog wee, but that's because it's very, very similar to wall barley, which is another Hordeum, which is incredibly common and often along the edges of paths and waysides and things like that. But the difference here, other than the location, is that wall barley has long overlapping pointed auricles, so even longer than those other ones, and that leaf sheath is somewhat inflated. So next time you want to, you see that grass growing up and you think, oh my God, that's such a nightmare grass. My dog had it stuck in their ear and their fur or whatever it is. Just have a look at the grass just for those features, because sometimes that can be quite useful to compare and contrast in your mind for the next time that you see meadow barley. So as I said, yeah, wall barley is very different habitats generally. You're going to find it waysides, pavements, disturbed ground, path edges. And if you do get it in fields, it tends to occur near the edges, maybe where in and out of where people come out of a gate or a stile, that sort of thing, rather than taking up a large majority of becoming the grassland sward. That would be more likely to be meadow barley. Then we've got reed canary grass, which is going to be one that you find in the neutral damp grassland, just because it's very reed-like. And that is exactly what it looks like. So it's very, very tall grass. It can be up to 200 centimeters tall, and it really can make you think, oh, that's common reed, that's Phragmites, because it's so huge and big, especially if it's not flowering, because or you're seeing it from a distance. The inflorescence itself is lobed, so it's a bit like cocksfoot in that sense, but just far more elongated, sort of in these lobed clusters. And the spikelets themselves, if you were to pick them apart, have only got the one floret inside. But to be honest, there must be so many of them there to make this chunky grass flower head. But the reason that it's quite useful to know that you can separate it from common reed is the fact that it has a membranous ligule and not a ring of hairs. So Phragmites, common reed, is one of the ones that has that lovely little sort of ring of circle of hairs as the ligule, whereas reed canary grass is more like other grasses and then it has that membranous ligule. So just to show you on a representation on these images, so common reed would have the ring of hairs when you pull it apart, and you can really see it, it's such a big grass, it's really good to look at. Whereas reed canary grass would have the more standard membranous ligule. So moving to greater Burnet-saxifrage now. Apologies, some of our images look like they were taken in the 70s. That's probably because they were. So we need to update our greater Burnet-saxifrage images, I think. This one is part of the carrot family, even though it looks quite a lot like, the leaves do look quite a lot like Valerian, don't they? But this one actually is a true carrot family. The stems themselves, like a lot of them in the family, are sort of ridged, but they are smooth generally, so not really rough, and they're hollow inside. All the leaves are once pinnate, so again, they're similar to what we were talking about before, with that one central midrib and then the individual leaflets coming off. The leaves themselves are really sort of a glossy dark green, so you know, it can be quite distinguishable from other plants around it. And the leaflets themselves are sort of this oval elliptical shape again, but again coarsely toothed. Now they have no bracts or bracteoles. So one of the things about the carrot family is these funny little sort of leaf-likey bits underneath the individual umbels and the main umbel. The ones at the base of the main umbel are bracts, and the ones underneath each individual umbel are bracteoles. But greater Burnet-saxifrage doesn't have any of these, so it's sort of naked in that respect. It's white flowered, like a lot of these in the family. And the other one that it could be confused with is lesser Burnet-saxifrage. However, that is a downy and rough plant generally, and also just slightly smaller. So another one that's in the carrot family and sort of similar when you don't see it flowering is, I'm afraid I forgot to change the title on that, sorry about it. This is a pepper saxifrage, which is in the carrot family, which is a really, really slender member of this family, very sort of delicate generally, and it has, again, solid and ridged stems. The lower leaves are sort of a generally triangular in shape. Some of these images aren't perfect, apologies for that, but they're more like 2 to 3 times pinnate, whereas when with the greater Burnet-saxifrage, again, ignore the title on here, that was once pinnate all over, whereas these are much more divided, so 2 to 3 times pinnate on here, and it can seem really, really fine and delicate, but not quite as fine and delicate as something like pignut, but still quite heavily divided. The leaflets themselves are linear or pinnatophyid, which means they kind of look like they're pinnate again, which is why we've got that 2 to 3 times pinnate, because obviously there's some variability. And they're very, very finely toothed. You'd have to look at them quite detailed to see that, and generally quite pointed. Apparently it smells peppery when crushed, so another one that I'd need to sort of go and you know, have a real whiff of. But unusually for like the carrot family, it has these sulphur yellow flowers. So there are a few in the family that have yellow flowers, things like wild parsnip and things like that. But this is the delicate one that is yellow flowered. So when it's flowering, it can be very easy to tell that's what you've got. And we were talking about those bracts and bracteoles. So with this species, pepper saxifrage, you've usually got no bracts, so there wouldn't be any of these ones at the bottom, but you do have bracteoles, the ones up here. When it says usually no bracts, so you can see here it says 0 to 3. So some you might have none, or you might have some. But yeah, so that's just some variability within the species. So again, as we've said before, if you need any help with identification of species, just remember to take good in-focus photos of flowers, leaves, and the whole plant. So don't just take one image, and because if it hasn't got basal leaves, then that could be a real key feature. So check that all the leaves look the same, take a picture of the leaf and of the flower and of the whole plant in general. Make a note of how it was growing, Was it a creeping? Was it quite erect? Was it sprawling? What was the rest of the vegetation like? You know, were there other species that you could identify, in which case list them alongside the one that you're trying to find out about? What were the growing conditions like? Was it really dry? Maybe quite bare ground? Maybe it looks like, you know, it's recently been established. Or was it quite wet and mossy, that sort of thing? And the time of year and the location are key to understanding what species we might be dealing with. So hopefully some people have got some questions, and I haven't confused you all with the fact that I've got to rename my pepper saxifrage on there, so apologies for that. That's what it's like doing a presentation in a rush. But yes, so I will have a quick look at the Q&A. Yeah,
we've had a few good questions. Actually, Sarah, I've been holding off because I thought it'd be useful for everybody to hear them and to hear the answers.
Yeah.
To a few of them. So the first one we've had here from Sarah is regarding clays and looms, which we all quite often mention, particularly when we're talking about habitat classification.
Yeah.
And actually how to know what that land is would be really helpful. So I wonder if you have got any tips for Sarah, please, Sarah, besides obviously getting your hands dirty and actually getting in there and having a good look at that soil.
Yeah, but by no means are we recommending that anyone takes a shovel or a trowel out with them and gives it a big dig. You know, absolutely no need to do that. So quite often the standard soil type that we refer to is a loam or a clay. So that's why this is sort of the neutral category. So it's not sandy, it's not sort of heavily chalky. It's sort of all of the other stuff is essentially clays and loams, and it's kind of like quite obvious that it's going to be like high diversity lush vegetation, that sort of thing, because it's more neutral. But also it's just that general feeling sometimes if you're walking around on the path edges and you're with wellies on and you get a lot of mud stuck to you, then that's going to be sort of like a heavy clay or loam, that sort of thing. But it's just generally all the other stuff that isn't really sandy or chalky. It's not peaty. It's kind of all the other stuff in between. So I hope that makes sense.
We've also got a question here from Paul.
Yeah.
Who I think you raised this question, Paul, while Sarah was talking about improved land, for example, or land that's undergoing different management types. And Paul's given us the example where a city council up in Worcester is actually trying to enhance many of the green spaces with cut and collect regimes. And he's interested to know if we are interested in a whole range of these urban habitats being surveyed and reported on.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you've got your square happens to be in a slightly urban or suburban area, and you've got some habitats within that are being managed as semi-natural habitats, then yes, you can include those as a plot, certainly. It's just whether you've got a square that covers that area, because a lot of our squares don't cover very urban areas. And it's whether basically the area is actually being managed as semi-natural, or whether it's still sort of maybe in that sort of amenity category, which we're currently not recording with NPMS. So it really depends on, you know, where your square is and how sort of semi-natural those habitats are.
Like as you say there, Sarah, semi-natural is sort of the buzz phrase there. We want to make sure that we're not recording anything that is being heavily managed, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, but equally, as I mentioned, playing fields and road verges, if they're being now appropriately managed and they've got that cut and collect regime, then you're almost certainly going to have a semi-natural assemblage of species, in which case it would be fine to include it.
Yeah. Right, I've found one more question here. Oh, another question just popped up. Please do carry on adding these questions. So Catherine has asked, what is the distribution of Gallum album? So we're talking about our hedge bedstraw, which of course is widespread across the UK in wood and scrub and rough grasslands and hedge banks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's I'd have to look at the BSBI distribution map, but I don't think it's a heavily restricted in terms of its distribution.
No, indeed, the map does show it very widespread from the south coast right up into,
you've had a look.
Up into Scotland, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
Up into Scotland, I think there's more records of it towards the west, but I think that's just a case of where the records have been recorded. It is very widespread across the UK.
I mean, generally, most of the NPMS indicator species will be widespread and not restricted to certain areas because of the fact that it's a national scheme and we want people to be able to record across the board. I mentioned obviously some of the sort of northern sort of more species specific, like wood cranesbill, the lady's mantle, the melancholy thistle, that sort of thing that's up in the northern area. And I know wood cranesbill's, I think, on the list as an indicator, but it's more relevant for north. But that's just because perhaps it's such a good indicator for that region. But generally, most of the species are sort of ubiquitous across the whole of the UK.
Oh, Paul's just commented that they've got lots of fantastic wildflower meadows and verges that are being managed in Worcester. You're very lucky. You've got a very proactive council there. Brilliant. We've got a couple of more general questions, now less sort of habitat specific, that I can just see. Richard's asked that we've talked about our local mentors and how do we find out where they are. I've popped a link there in the Q&A box, and if you can locate that, that's where our you can find our mentor contact directory. That's on the resources page of our website. So you can just head to our website and look for that. There's a list of our contacts and their contact details, and they are basically within categories of their location, essentially. So you can take a look for the one that's closest to you, or if there's a couple. Unfortunately, we do have a couple of gaps currently that we are working on trying to fill. But that doesn't mean if you find that there is nobody in your region, then you're stumped and you can't get in touch. By all means, feel free to contact a member in another region. They generally really don't mind, but of course you can contact us. So the support at npms.org.uk. We are happy to act almost as mentors in your area as well. But also, we're finding there are more opportunities for linking up volunteers. So while they may not be a mentor, they may be an experienced volunteer in your area that might be happy to team up. So don't stop looking, get in touch, and we can have a chat about it. Let me look a bit further down. Catherine, you've asked, do we have any in-person field training planned this season? That's a really good question, Catherine. We are hoping to do some bits and pieces out in the field. This has been quite a tricky thing in the past. It can be quite hard to get enough folk to come along, surprisingly believe it or not. So we've quite often had trouble with this. So what we're trying to do this season is to encourage regional meetups. So by getting in touch with those local mentors, for example, or coming straight to NPMS support with any ideas that you may have, or if we have enough people in one region that would like to get together, we are so happy to support this and support our mentors to put on. And that can be a range of things, whether there's particular training needs that have been identified, or even less formal get-togethers where people want to go for a walk, or if they're having particular trouble on their square and they'd quite like to get together with other local volunteers on their square and perhaps a mentor or us. And we can arrange those. So please do get in touch with your local mentors with any ideas, or us with any ideas. We are hoping to put on some other training as well in the field. And the other thing I would say is on that front, we're hoping to run next month, or we are running next month, I should say, some regional online get-together. So I realise that's not the answer to your question in terms of in training, but that'll be a really good opportunity to chat about these opportunities and any interest and people wanting to partake in training in their region or get-togethers in their region. So I hope that answers that question. Sarah, did you have any other?
Well, just to say that if you're looking at sort of just general botanical guidance rather than NPMS methodology stuff, which mostly we cover through online training anyway, I would say, do get in touch with any local botany or flora groups that you can find. The BSBI have a great map showing you what kind of groups are active near you. And you can usually just send them an email and say, look, I want to improve my botanical skills. Can I please come along with you? And they're always welcome of new people. So, and it's a great way to learn if you've got the time to go out with them. Otherwise, just, keep going out with anyone who's interested and try and learn together is another tip as well.
Yeah, completely. I think we're seeing more and more people are asking for buddying up opportunities, or folk on the Facebook support group, for example, asking if there's anybody local to them that would like to shadow or would like to join forces, as it were. And Catherine, you just very kindly commented that you're happy to mentor folk in Aberdeenshire. Well, you've said it now. I've popped down your name. We actually have a video available at the moment on our on the NPMS YouTube video, or there's actually a blog that's recently gone up on our website about becoming a mentor. So do take a look at those. That'll give you some information about what that entails, what, you know, different ways you can get involved, because there are a number of different ways depending on your availability, of course, and your interest. And then I'm going to be emailing you for sure now that you've said that, and we can have a chat about how you can be involved. So thank you.
I thought I'd just mention also at the end here about, I don't know if you can easily link it into the chat, Rachel, but the video that we did last year with Dominic for the neutral grasslands and damp grasslands, it might be useful if you want to supplement your learning from today with some of the other species that are NPMS indicators, then that would be quite useful. So yeah, I do have a look at our YouTube channel, so we've got lots of other videos that can help you on there.
Well, I've just popped a link on there to the YouTube channel as a whole. I haven't gone to a particular,
well, that's
our
fine,
big
yeah.
list of videos. I haven't done a particular one because, as Sarah said, there's actually quite a few on there. There's a few lowland grassland, damp grassland videos on there. So I didn't want to pick any out in case it meant that you'd miss some. So do take have a good look through that big list, because there's so many resources on there, really helpful, all the way from survey methodology right up to these more specific habitat, specific training videos. So do take a look.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, I think we are probably come to the end of the question and answer session, but thanks for everyone for coming today and for listening and enduring. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. So
many thank you, Sarah. That was really, really helpful. And thank you everybody so much for joining us and for your questions. If you think of any other questions, do just get in touch with the support email address afterwards.
That's great. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.